Good morning again, everybody. It's good to see all of you. I'm very excited about our Facetime interview this morning. We have Dr. Joel Pickett with us today. But Joel didn't just show up recently. He and Sandy have been here since before we started the church. In fact, they opened up their home for the church to actually meet. You know, we announced that we were going to start the church, and several people said, well, we want to go ahead and start now. So Sandy said, well, I'll just open up my house, and they've got a big living room, and we just piled in there on Sundays, and we did that for a month or two before we started, and Sandy, of course, is on our board, and they have been a huge support to this church and a big encouragement to Lene and me since the very announcement of the net. And so I really appreciate them. But Joel is a very accomplished man. He is a father. He is a husband. But he's also a neurosurgeon. He is a pilot. He is an artist. He's a great storyteller. And but most of all, he is a man of God. And I just so appreciate that about Joel. It's so good for me, and those of you who know him and who've had conversations with him, you have experienced the same thing I have, that when you talk to him and he tells stories and he talks to you about God, if you ever talk to him about Jesus, it just gets anointed real quick. And it's amazing. And so I wanted, during this series, to ask him, and he was the first one I asked. I said, you can pick any date that you want. I said, if you'll just come and share your story with us. And so it's just great to have him here. And so would you welcome Dr. Joel Pickett to the stage? Well, I don't know if this is going to go according to script this morning, but I do have one. There's this story that you tell, and I asked you previously if you would just start with that story. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. Basically, I guess you would say it's the story of my life, and in retrospect and looking back on it. And I guess that it's mostly a story of faith. Not that I had great faith. It was the struggle for faith and the search for faith. I wanted to have faith in God. I saw what it looked like when people had faith. My parents had faith. They had faith like a stone. It was immeasurable, their faith. It was complete. My father's faith in God was like my faith in gravity. He never questioned it. But even as a child, I looked, I had questions, and I pondered this, and I remember when I was 10 or 11 years old, my parents were both pillars in the church. My father was the worship leader at our church, and he taught the adult Bible study. My mother taught the ladies' Bible study, and they were both leaders in the church, had helped found a church. And so they were real Bible scholars. My mother, to this day, I don't think I've ever met anybody that understands the Bible or knows the Bible better than her. And so I was about 10 or 11 years old. I went to my father, and he was working. It was on a Saturday night. I'll never forget it. He was working on his lesson for the next Sunday morning. And I said, Dad, what if all of this is wrong? What if we're wrong? What if there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God? Because that's what I heard a lot of in school, in science courses and things like that. And I said, what if going to church twice on Sunday and every Wednesday night is just a waste of time? And he said, well, what if it is true? And you didn't do those things, and you didn't live your life as a Christian? You'd be in a bad place. But I said, well, I understand that. But what if it's not true? What if there is no heaven? And when you die, you're just dead. You're just gone. And he said, okay, well, what if it isn't true? But everybody on earth was a Christian. And everybody did their best to live a Christian life. Would the world be better? And I said, yeah. He said, then it's worth doing, even if it's not true. And so that stuck with me, and basically, whenever I doubted things or my faith was weak, that was good enough. Do my part to make the world a better place. It's good enough. And so I guess that my feelings toward God were somewhat bland. I mean, I really hoped that there was a God, I guess. And I prayed, hoping that there was a God and that he would hear my prayers, but I wasn't always certain. And I went through all of my adult life that way, pretty much, hoping that my faith would strengthen. I asked God to strengthen my faith. And then I had an event that occurred that made me kind of look back on my life. And everybody looks back on their life from time to time. And I'm not talking about the snapshots of reminiscence. I'm talking about the journey you take when you look back at your life. The forest, not the trees. And the directions you take. And when I finally did that, I saw God's handprints all over my life. Unquestionable. And even as a child, I thought, man, it would be so easy to have faith. If Jesus were walking around curing people of illnesses and raising the dead, I would have no trouble having faith then. That's what I need to see. If I saw someone part the Gulf of Mexico, and I would have no trouble having faith. But I never got those things, and none of us do. But there are other things, and I suspect that every person in this room, if they look back at their life, would see God's handprints on it. And my story actually starts long before I was born. And there was a young man that had gotten out of the army. The Korean War had ended, and he was involved in. And he got a job as an automobile mechanic in a poor Mississippi Delta town in Arkansas. And he visited this diner to eat, and there was a waitress there that caught his eye, or maybe he caught her eye. Someone's eye got caught. And she was no older than Hannah, my youngest daughter. She was a teenager, still a teenager. But they fell in love, and they were ultimately married. And they were totally different. Those two people were totally different, almost opposites, as close to being opposites as you could be. But they did have one thing in common: their love for the Lord and their faith in God. And so they started this life together. And living in the South, and some of you may have known this, but in the 50s, the Depression hadn't ended down here. Things were not good here in the South. And it was hard to make a living in Arkansas and Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma. It was tough. Well, there was a friend of theirs that went to their church that said, listen, I have talked to this guy in California. He has a job for two guys. It's perfect for us. He's promised us this job, more money than we could ever make here. We just got to go to Arkansas, or go to California from Arkansas, the land of milk and honey. And that's a big deal, because they didn't have much time. We got to get out there right away. He's holding the job for us. He's promised us this job is ours. He ran a hay baling operation out there, and these two men and their young wives sold what they couldn't carry in one car apiece. They headed to California. And they got there, and this man was not an honest man. And there was no job. And it was not a land of milk and honey. And the jobs were no easier to find there than they were in Arkansas. And so the friend said, listen, they found some odd jobs here and there, but they were not doing well. And the friend said, listen, I'm going back to Arkansas. I can get my job back there. You need to go too. You can get your job back. But he said, no, we've talked about this. We've prayed about it. We feel like we should stay here. Why on earth would you stay here? He said, I don't know. I just feel like we should stay here. And so He ultimately found a job that he could make a living doing. They found a church, they joined the church, and they settled down to start their life in California. She became pregnant, but the pregnancy didn't last. It terminated with a miscarriage. That's okay. Their doctor told them it was okay. That happens sometimes, not to worry. She became pregnant again. Same thing. And again. And again. And their doctor told them, I don't think that you're going to be able to carry a child. And you need to think about maybe adopting if you want to have a family. This is not what they wanted to hear, but it was what they heard. Well, that doctor got a phone call from a colleague in Southern California. Now, they were in Northern California. Now, the difference between Southern California and Northern California is a lot, okay? That's a long distance. That'd be like someone getting a call here from someone in North Carolina, out of the blue. A colleague, an acquaintance, not a close friend. He said, listen, I have this young girl, and she's pregnant. She's going to deliver the baby. She wants to deliver it, but she wants to put it up for adoption, and I just really feel like I need to find a good family for this baby. I'm just curious, would you happen to have a couple? And he said, oh man, do I have a couple for you. And so that baby was adopted, essentially, before he was born. And of course, that was me. And so they drove down to Southern California when I was born, and they picked me up and took me home to raise me as their own. And they felt like God had given them a gift. And they couldn't have loved me more than if I'd been their biological child. There's no doubt about that. And so about a year after they adopted me, my mother became pregnant. No trouble. My first sister was born, healthy as could be, not a bit of problems. A little more than a year later, she became pregnant again. My second sister was born. No trouble. Now, for someone that just could not carry a child, that was odd. But had they have had those two girls, they would never have adopted. Had they not have moved to California, they'd never been available to adopt. And so, I feel like that there was some of God's handiwork there, no doubt about it. But I grew up in that home, and it was in a church home, in a loving family. And my parents truly were God's sheep, a part of his flock, an important part. And I believe that everybody, every human being on earth is called by God in some form or fashion. I truly believe that. And I think the call is often soft. It's the first time he calls you, it's little more than a breeze, a whisper. Now, there are some people who hear it. They're poised. They seem ready. They seem like they're waiting for that call. And as soon as they hear it, here I am, Lord, send me. But I'm not one of those people. He had to call back repeatedly. He left messages. And it took decades for me to finally get back to him. But he gets louder each time. And eventually, he's yelling. And finally, if you're like me, he may even grab you by the collar a little, shake you. So, the first time that I feel like that he kind of mentioned to me about going into healthcare, I was still just a child, and I asked my mother how long it took to become a doctor. And she said, well, you have to go to school for that. And I said, well, okay. I said, how long? And she said, about 8 years. Now, she was wrong. To be a neurosurgeon, it's about twice that. But 8 years was enough for me to say, well, that's out of the question. I hated school. I hated my first day at kindergarten. I came home from kindergarten. My mom said, "How was school?" I said, "I'm not going back." She said, "Yeah, you are." So I hated every day of school from the first day of kindergarten to my last day of residency. I did not like school. I'm just not made to go to school, but I went to school longer than you can imagine. So I didn't answer that. But growing up, people told me that I ought to be an engineer, and I bet there's engineers out here right now, and I applaud you for being engineers, but when I finished high school, I went into engineering, took that route, and I saw right away, I'm not an engineer. Yeah, it's not for me. But I took this test in high school. They gave this aptitude test, and it kind of gave you an idea of what field you might be good at, and I scored highest in the medical area. Engineering was third. And somebody said, "Look, you're going to engineering, and it's third." And I said, "Yeah, well, whatever." So I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I kind of goofed off my first year of college because I wasn't happy with what I was doing. I didn't make that good of grades. But it was hard to go to college. It was hard to pay the way. I had expenses. My parents couldn't afford to send me to school. I worked every summer, but I needed a part-time job to help cover some of the expenses. And jobs were hard to find, but I had a friend that worked at the local hospital. And I asked him to check to see if there was any openings for maybe another college student, and there was. I found out that there was an opening in the emergency room, and I managed to get that job working as a ward clerk in the emergency room. And immediately, I saw that, wow, this is what I need to do. There's something here for me. It was incredible. It was like an epiphany for me. And so now that I've screwed up 1 year of college, I decided I wanted to go in one of the most competitive fields there were, and that was to go to medical school. So I didn't get off to a good start. I corrected my grades from there on out, but at that time, there were at least 20 people applying for every slot in medical school. And they didn't need to take people that messed up 1 year, because there were plenty of people who didn't mess up any. And so I felt like that's what I should do, but I didn't feel that maybe I could. I had self-doubt. And I decided that I would go to graduate school. I had managed to move up in the hospital and get some other training and stuff, and I'd become a respiratory therapist, and I decided to go and get my graduate degree in intensive care, critical care. And there was a program at Emory that I applied to and was accepted, and I thought, if I go through this will bolster sort of my resume, maybe I can get into medical school. But when I got there, the program was not as it had been described to me, and there were many faults with it. And it was super expensive, and they were not giving me the training that they said they would. So I called my advisor from college, and I said, if I drop out of this after the first semester, I finished the first semester, and I drop out before I finish the program, will that interfere with me going to medical school? And he said, I don't know. It might, but I don't know. I can't answer that. But he said, I know someone who can. And I said, who? And he said, the dean of the medical school. And he gave me his name. He said, why don't you call him? And I said, call the dean of the medical school. And he said, that's what I would do. And I said, okay. So I called the dean of the medical school. I got this secretary on the phone. And I told her that I was a student and that I was wondering what my chances of getting into medical school would be. I had some questions. Could I talk to him? And she said, just a minute. And he came on the phone. I don't know why he took that call. I can't imagine the dean of a medical school going, what is it? I'm not taking that. Answer his questions for him. I'm sure he would just handed it off. But for some reason, he came on the phone. And I told him my story, and he said, well, I think if you explain it that way, if you explain it like you just have, that will not keep you out of medical school. Now, when you get the application, there's an essay section, and I would explain it just the way you described it to me. And I said, okay, then I'll apply to medical school next year. He goes, why don't you apply this year? And I said, well, there isn't time. He goes, the deadline is in 3 days. And I said, that's what I mean, there isn't time. And he goes, there is if I overnight you the application, and you fill it out immediately, and you overnight it back to me personally, I will see to it that it gets there in time. And
Did you realize at that point you were actually going to get into medical school?
No.
You didn't?
I didn't. And I didn't. And I said, well, the odds of, he says, I insist. I am overnighting you this application. Now, why this guy took an interest in me, I don't know. He didn't know me. And I guarantee you in his entire career, he never probably overnighted an application to anybody else. But something moved him to overnight this application to me. I rented a typewriter because I didn't have one. I filled it out, and I overnighted it back to him. Moved back to Arkansas. And so I was waiting to hear from him, and I got an invitation to interview. Well, that's the first step. At least they didn't rule me out right up front. I got an interview. So I went to my interview, and it was in the winter, and I was sick. I had a winter cold. I felt terrible. I borrowed $20 for gas to drive to Little Rock. I wore the only tie I owned, and I went for my interview, and the secretary was real sweet, and she said, your first interview, and the only one I remember from that day, is with Dr. Chowdhury. Dr. Chowdhury is one of our physiologists. I said, okay. She took me to his office, and it was full of books and clutter and paper stacked up on his desk. And when she opened the door, she knocked on the door, and he said, come in. And she opened the door. He's sitting behind the desk, and she said, this is Joel Pickett. He's a medical school applicant. And he says, come in. And he was of Indian descent. Indian, not Native American Indian. And he said, sit down. And so I sat down, my head was stopped up, and he said, so, what do you think was the most reason that you want to go to know? But medical shelter. But you watch out. And I mean, my blood turned to ice. I didn't understand anything he said. What kind of interview is this going to be? And I said, okay, just calm down, man, just calm down. I said, I'm so sorry. Could you repeat the question? And he said, sure. What did you say was the mountain ride? I said, okay, that sounded the same. I can't answer that question. I'm going to have to ask him to repeat it again. I said, I am sorry. I have a cold. My head stopped up. Could you repeat that one more time? It sounded exactly the same. He was very patient with me. And by then, I said, this is awful. I can't get a medical. He's going to think I'm an idiot. What am I going to do, God? And God said, start talking. And so that's what I did. I just started talking. And I told him that, well, I first decided I wanted to go to medical school when I was working as a respiratory therapist. And he stopped me. He goes, wait a minute. You're a respiratory therapist? And I said, yes. So he asked me some questions, and I could understand. I was getting where I could understand some of what he was saying. He asked me some questions about drugs used in respiratory therapy, and I answered those correctly. They were not tough questions. And that seemed to impress him a little bit. And he said, I'm a pulmonary physiologist. I do research on pulmonary physiology. And I said, really? What kind of research? And he said, mostly heavy metal research. And I said, heavy metals on the lungs? And he said, yes. I said, like selenium. And he said, you know about selenium? And I said, yeah, I know a little bit about it. He goes, that's amazing. You have to come here and go to medical school and work in my lab. And then we talked for a little while, and then he goes, oh, wait a minute, I got to answer these questions. And he wrote some stuff down that it was supposed to be answered from the interview. He says, I've really enjoyed talking to you. He said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Batesville. It's a little town in Arkansas. And he said, no, before that. And I said, well, Heber Springs, another little town in Arkansas. He goes, no, before that. And I said, well, I grew up in Northern California. And he goes, it's so nice to talk to someone without that Southern accent. I can't understand anybody around him. And I said, where are you from? And he said, New Jersey. And I was really tempted to say, no, before that. But I decided that would be pushing my luck.
So you get into medical school, obviously, but there's a point that you talk about where you had this love for flying, right?
Yeah, and that actually before medical school, I always wanted to fly. Flying's very expensive, and I didn't have the money to fly, but the military would pay for you to fly, and that was something I always considered. And in fact, the whole thought of flying an airplane with a gun on it really appealed to me. That sounded like a lot of fun. And so I had met a Navy recruiter when I was in college, and he was going to college and taking courses. And I helped him with his courses. You know, he came to me because some of these courses were science courses, and he didn't understand things like physics and stuff, and I helped him with them. And we became friends. And so while I was waiting to hear from the stuff in, medical school, I had this application pending, I started thinking, because he had tried to talk me into going in the Navy before and going to flight school, and I decided, well, you know what? I don't think I'm going to get into medical school. I think if I'm going to ever be a fighter pilot, I need to go ahead and do it. So I went back to him, and I went through the process of taking tests, getting a physical, and the tests were kind of neat. They were tests of box folding tests and pictures of the horizon and pictures of airplanes. You had to match them up. All these kind of things are kind of spatial orientation questions, in addition to a lot of science and stuff like that. I took all these tests, passed everything I needed to pass. All I needed to do was sign up. Down to that, just sign up. But I hadn't really heard the final word yet from medical school, and so I had gotten a letter finally, and it said, you're on the alternate list for medical school. The alternate list, I think I was number 11 on the alternate list. The alternate list means you almost got into medical school. And that's not something you can really brag about. I mean, it's not like something you put on your, almost got in, almost. That close, I almost got into medical school. Quite an accomplishment. It's not
like
horseshoes.
Getting the silver medal, right?
Yeah, no, that's just, almost is not good enough. But you never know, someone may, and if I'd have been number 2 on the alternate list, I'd say, hey, a pretty good chance I'll get in. Someone, might not come. They may decide not to go or, whatever. But 11, I don't think so, man. Not going to happen. So, but I was waiting, and I said, well, okay, this fall, if I don't get into medical school, I'm going to join the Navy. I'm going to fly. And I thought, if you just let me fly those airplanes, I'm sure I'll pass whatever tests you have. I'm sure I'll be able to fly them. And so I was about ready to give up on it, and I got this call, and it was the Dean of Student Affairs from the medical school. And he said, Joel Pickett? I said, yeah. He said, this is Therese Schultz. I'm the Dean of Student Affairs. And he said, you're on the alternate list. I said, yes. He goes, your name's up. My name's up? What do you mean? He said, your name's up. There's somebody who's not coming. The person that was right ahead of you was offered this slot, and they elected to defer until next year because there isn't much time left. I mean, the school's about to start, and they are going to start next year. And you have that same offer. You can defer till next year if you want to, because there isn't much time. And I said, well, how much time do I have? I mean, it'll take me about 3 hours to get there. And he said, well, you have more than 3 hours. It's about a week. I said, okay, I'm in then. No deferment. I'm ready to go. I'll be there. And so I got in, and I had already decided that if I could go to medical school, I wanted to be a physician, but I also wanted to be a pilot. But I could be a physician, practice medicine for a living, and fly as a hobby. But you can't fly as a professional pilot and practice medicine as a hobby. That's kind of hard to do.
Now, but you cheated a little bit. A few years ago, you actually owned a fighter jet, right?
Right, yeah, I did ultimately get a fighter plane. I didn't have a gun on it, okay? You can't do that. That's illegal. But it was an ex-Soviet fighter plane, so I did fly fighter planes some, and so I kind of got to fulfill my dream there a little bit.
That's what you did to relax, right?
Right, to relax, exactly.
Now, you talk about struggling with your faith like all of us do. I'm sure every so often you still struggle at times. And you talked about healing, and if you could just, if we could all see, Jesus healing and doing miracles and that sort of thing, it'd be easy to believe. But now God has put you in a position where you are providing healing to other people. You're a neurosurgeon. You deal with, the most fascinating thing to me whenever we talk is how heavy and how how responsible you are for this person who's laying on the table, and you're responsible for their life. Their life is literally in your hands, and yet you say that it's really in God's hands. And you talk about it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's I don't believe that we accomplish anything on our own. And people accomplish things, people do great things, and every person at some point in their life manages to do wonderful things. And I try to teach my children that every person they meet is better than them at something. And that's how I view the world. But whatever you accomplish and whatever I accomplish, it's not really just us. We do what we can, but let's say that you're a very gifted singer and people say, you are such a beautiful singer. Well, that was a gift. You didn't earn that. And if you're a brilliant artist and you can paint well, that was a gift. You didn't deserve it. You didn't create it. It was strictly a gift. And if you're a surgeon and you're operating on someone, you were provided an education which was gifted, and a brain to be able to absorb it and understand it, and hands to carry out the surgery. It was all a gift.
There's also something that you told me about being on a hunting trip and observing these sheep. Can you tell us a little bit about it? You identified with
Sure.
that story.
Well, the thing that made me look back on my life and see all these different steps, and even when I got accepted in the neurosurgery, I was accepted out of the normal way. You would not believe, and it is much like me getting into medical school. The chairman of neurosurgery called me because he heard from another chairman that I was changing careers. I'd picked the wrong career. We veer off course sometimes, and God corrects us. And I veered off course in my life, and every time I did, he would correct me, sometimes brutally, but he would correct me. And so I eventually became a neurosurgeon, which I feel, and I'm convinced, completely convinced I finally did what he wanted me to do, even though I tried to do different things, just like Jonah did. I tried to do different things, but he corrected me. And so I was on an elk hunt, a bow hunt for elk out west many years ago, and I was already a neurosurgeon and practicing and everything. And it was on a sheep ranch, a huge sheep ranch. And I was with the owner of the ranch, and we were driving back on these gravel roads back into his ranch to head to the lodge where we were going to be hunting out of. And we passed one of the many big herds of sheep. And these sheep herds are 20, 30,000 sheep in them. And the shepherds were out there. One of the shepherds, I saw them, some of these sheep were crossing this road, and we had to stop while they crossed. And he told me, I said, well, how long have you all raised sheep? He said, well, we've been raising sheep in my family here on this ranch for over 150 years. He said, all those shepherds are from Peru. The Peruvian shepherds are the best shepherds in the world. And so I was watching them, and I noticed that one of the sheep, I thought was a sheep, came out of the herd of sheep and went over by the shepherd, and it wasn't a sheep at all. It was a Great Pyrenees dog. And I said, that's a Great Pyrenees. And he said, yeah, the shepherds use those. And I said, they use those to herd the sheep? And he goes, no, they don't. They use border collies to herd the sheep. And then he told me about the Great Pyrenees dogs that the Peruvian shepherds used. The shepherd handpicks one of these puppies from a litter, and he places it in the herd with a ewe that probably lost a lamb as a puppy. And she raises that dog as a sheep. Now the dog grows up with the sheep, and he thinks he's a sheep. He is a sheep. The other sheep thinks he's a sheep. He looks like a sheep. He's about the same size as a sheep. He's the same color. His fur is very similar. But he's a little different. He's a little different than the other sheep. He probably knows that. Maybe he doesn't. But he loves the other sheep. and they love him. And he leads his life as a sheep, mixed in there with the herd. And you would probably never see him. If a herd of sheep came by and there was a Pyrenees dog in there, you would never see it. It'd blend right in.
And the shepherd treats him like a sheep, right?
The shepherd treats him like a sheep, and the shepherd loves him. And he loves the shepherd just as he loves the sheep. And in a night, when it's dark, and the coyote comes, and the shepherd's nowhere to be seen, the coyote comes to take a lamb. One of the sheep steps out of the herd, which is unlike the sheep, because they really don't have any defense. They usually run from the coyote, and he can take the sheep, if the shepherd's not around, without any trouble. But this sheep is different, and that's the last thing the coyote sees. And so when he told me about those, I looked back on my life. That's what caused me to reflect back on the journey that I'd taken. The puppy being placed with the sheep that had lost the lamb. And I realized that God had a plan for me all along, and that was to help him tend his sheep.
You go after that coyote every day, don't you?
More or less.
Yeah. Joel, you and Sandy have suffered the loss of 2 children. I cannot imagine that kind of pain. And it's fascinating to me to hear you talk about that. And how you have dealt with that, and then how that has equipped you to deal with the people that you have to give bad news to. Because as a neurosurgeon, you have to talk to families who are suffering that kind of pain, that kind of loss. I asked Joel, I said, I wouldn't ask you to talk about this unless you want to talk about it. He said, no. He said, I would be glad to talk about it.
Well, losing a child is grief that is so strong that it causes physical pain. I mean, everybody in here has had grief. If you haven't lost a child, then it's hard to appreciate it, but it is a physical pain, as though something has been torn loose inside of you, something physical. It actually literally hurts. And those of you that have lost a child know exactly what I'm talking about. And so I do meet people that have lost children, and it's not always a child. And when I have a medical student with me, I have to go and talk to a family about some disaster that just happened to their family that's taken someone from them, a tragedy, a ruptured aneurysm or an automobile accident, and they've suddenly been stripped of someone that should have had many, many years of life left, and it's now gone. What I'll usually ask the medical student who sat there quietly while I spoke to the family, when we're leaving, I'll say, do you know what today's date is? And they have to think. I said, you don't know what today's date is? It's an important date. No, what's special about today's date? Nothing. I said, it's special to them. They will never forget this date. And so when you talk to them about this, remember that. They'll never forget your words. And so when I talk to folks that have lost a child, what I tell them is that eventually they'll stop sobbing. And eventually they'll only cry when they think about them. And eventually they'll be able to think about them and not cry. And finally, they'll be able to think about them and smile. But it takes a long time.
What kind of faith does it take to get past that?
I don't know how to answer that question really. I've seen people become bitter at the loss of a child and angry and sort of lash out at God and how could God take a child from someone? What kind of God would do that? That wasn't my question to God. He does say that it rains on the just and on the unjust. That's a bit more than a rain shower, in my opinion. Okay, that's, I think of it as a hammer blow. And there's no doubt about it that sometimes he shapes us with a hammer. And I ask him why I needed that much pressure, why I needed that kind of hammer blow. But I don't know that there's a real answer for it. And I can tell you that the people that are most angry at the loss of their child and the most bitter tend to be the ones that don't have a good relationship with God to start with.
I'd never thought about this, but you said at lunch the other day, you said, you told me about Hannah and Jack.
Yeah, Hannah and Jackson, when we lost Joey, we decided that, though we were kind of older, we decided we'd try one more time to have children and try to fill that void. And you can kind of look at that as however you want, but we just felt compelled to do that. And Sandy became pregnant, and we were going to have a baby, but instead we had two. And little did we know that God was already replacing one that we hadn't lost yet, and that was Walker, who we would lose later. And so we asked for one child, and because we couldn't look into the future, he took care of that for us.
Wow. I want to thank you for sharing that. There was a crazy guy that you went to college with. And I love to hear you talk about this guy. We're talking about faith today. We're talking about trust. And I asked Joe if he would share this story.
Yeah, there was a guy that I went to school with named Phil. And Phil was from Alaska. He was probably 3 or 4 generations Alaskan. And I don't know if y'all have ever met anybody that's from Alaska. I mean, really from Alaska. They somehow during the natural selection of living in Alaska for generations, they lose the fear gene. Okay, they don't have it. And that was Wild Phil. We called him Wild Phil. And Phil had his pilot's license because everybody does in Alaska. That's how you travel around. And so we would go to this little airport, and Phil's parents would pay for him to fly because he wanted to be a pilot, a professional pilot. So he'd say, hey, I'm going to go fly some. You want to go? And so, yeah, he'd rent this little airplane. It was a little tail dragger, a little 2-seater airplane, a little Cessna. And so we would fly that. And one day we were flying over the lake, which is Greer's Ferry Lake in Arkansas. And there was an island down there. And he goes, hey, now, Phil's from Alaska, okay? This seems crazy for someone to do this down here, but for Alaska, this was not that crazy. He goes, hey, look at that island. You want to land on it? I said, can you land on that island? Oh, yeah, we can land on that island. Let's land on the island. Okay, sounds fun to me. So he lands on this island. Well, it looked smooth from the air, okay? The grass, there were no trees on it, just a grass patch out there, but it wasn't very big. And he landed on this island, and it was really rough. We're bounced over, but he got it stopped. And I said, whoa, that was rough. I said, you can take off from this island? And he goes, I think so. And I said, you think so? And he said, yeah, I think so. Pretty sure. And that's the way Phil was. I mean, he was, as long as it's 80% sure, then it's good enough to go. Let's go. And so we messed around on the island a bit, and he goes, okay, let's go. And he says, give me a hand with the airplane. I said, what do you got to do? He goes, well, we need all the distance we can get out of this little island. So we took that airplane and we drug it back into the water on one end of the island so that the main gear and the tail and everything was in the water, okay? Then we got in the airplane and he started it, and then a little tiny motor in that thing, revved it all the way up, full power, feet on the brakes. And he let off the brakes, and it's not that fast. It's not that powerful. So it starts rolling forward. It's rolling, and we'd hit bumps. We'd hit these bumps, and that would slow us down. And then we'd speed up a little bit. We'd hit bumps, and I can see the end of the island. It's coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. And I mean, you know, and we're not flying. I'm pretty sure I could run this fast, Phil. That's what I was thinking. And there it comes. There's the edge of the water. And I know when we hit that water, we're just going to flip over. That's going to be it. And Phil's just as calm as he could be. And we get right before the edge of the water, and he pulls back on the yoke, and the stall warning's going off, and it's beeping, beep, 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 and this thing is just wallowing just above the water. And I'm sure the tires are touching the water, touching off and on. And we're slowly building up speed. And finally we're a foot off of the water, and then 2 feet, and then 5 foot, and then finally we're flying. He kind of levels it out a little bit and builds up a little speed, and we're good. And he goes, yeah, I was pretty sure we could make it.
Well, that's awesome. I just thought of this. This is another kind of funny story that you told me about flying. But mutual friend of ours, Richard, I believe it was Richard. Was it Richard that was flying with you?
Yeah.
He asked you a question like when y'all were about to. Was it when you were about to take off?
Oh, that was another guy, yeah. But he's kind of like Richard.
Yeah.
I was going on a hunting trip once, and a friend called me and said, hey, there's a guy going on the same hunting trip you are on. You don't know him, but he's going to be hunting in the same group you are. And he asked me if he could ride with you guys in your plane, because you're going out there anyway, same time, same place. And he's a good guy. And I said, sure. And so this guy that knew me and knew him was a practical joker. And so I said, just tell him be at the airport, such and such hour we'll be leaving. So he tells the guy, he says, listen, he said you could go, but you need to get out there about 30 minutes early because he needs to go over some things with you because you're going to have to sit up front with him and help him fly the airplane. The guy that normally does that's not going to be able to go, and he's going to have to give you some instructions. It's real important that you get out there. And so I get to the airport, and I don't know he's told him all this. I get to the airport, and he's there waiting for me. And he says, he told me that I need to be out here to help you fly it. I said, no, you don't have to help me. You don't have to help me fly it. I can fly it by myself. And he said, oh, okay, well, that's a relief. I said, he was messing with you. Don't worry about that. And he said, well, can I sit up front with you anyway? And I said, sure, you can sit up front. So we all load on the airplane. Everybody's going, and he's sitting up in the co-pilot seat with me. And the plane I fly is a turboprop plane, and it's not one of the easier planes to fly, and it's something an experienced pilot flies. It's not for an inexperienced pilot. And so he's looking at the panel, and it's got all these gauges and all these, radios and everything. And he goes, are these the radios right here? And I said, those are the radios. And he says, so if something happens to you, I can get on this radio and talk to someone. They'll tell me what I need to know so I can safely land this aircraft. And I said, no. Well, what if something happens to you? If something happens to me, you're going to die. And he said, okay. Well, what if there was a pilot in the back, say some guy that had flown a little Cessna 172 or something like that, and he came up here, and he knew a little bit about flying. Could he get on the radio and talk to somebody and then land the plane? And I said, no. You just crashed near the airport. And he said, oh, okay. I said, just pray that nothing happens to me. You'll be okay.
So faith in action. Faith in action. Let's thank Dr. Joel Pickett for sharing with us.